El Salvador is one of the smallest countries in all of the Americas, with a territorial area that has seen a significant reduction in poverty and inequality in recent years, according to the World Bank. An example of this is the poverty rate, which decreased by nearly 50% by 2019, and extreme poverty, which went from 10% in 2010 to almost 1% in 2019. Additionally, according to the Gini Index, inequalities among the population reached historic lows in 2019, making it the lowest in the region. However, on this journey, we will go much further than the projections and ideas that can be generated solely from statistical data, as these may not correspond to the everyday life of the country's inhabitants. The recent history of El Salvador is filled with many facts that will make this walk extraordinary, so extraordinary that we will divide it into two parts. Join us in this first exceptional part of our extraordinary walk into everyday life in El Salvador after the arrival of Bukele. Nayib Armando Bukele Ortez, a Salvadoran of Palestinian descent, is the 60th president of El Salvador and the youngest in the region's history at 42 years old. He succeeded former President Salvador Sánchez Cerén and began his presidency on June 1, 2019, after winning the elections held on February 3 of the same year. Bukele assumed the presidency with the backing of 53.1% of the votes cast by the nation's main electoral body. He is known for his charismatic political style and active presence on social media. His political ideology has been primarily described as center-right. Bukele ran for the presidency as a candidate of the Grand Alliance for National Unity, Ghana, party, although he had previously been a member of the Farabundo Martin National Liberation Front, FMLN, a left-wing party in El Salvador. However, he was expelled from the FMLN in 2017 and then joined Ghana for his presidential campaign. During his presidency, as we will explore in our extraordinary journey today, Bukele has focused on issues of security, infrastructure, and economic development. He is a controversial figure due to his often authoritarian style of governance, which includes using social media to communicate directly with the Salvadoran people and making decisions without congressional approval. The administration of Bukele has placed El Salvador in the international spotlight, especially due to his decisions regarding the enforcement of laws to reduce the historically high levels of violence that have affected the country. It's important to note that El Salvador was one of the countries in the region where the international gang group Mara Salvatrucha, in its various subdivisions, had a strong presence. Mara Salvatrucha, commonly known as MS-13, is a street gang that originated in Los Angeles, California, United States, in the 1980s. Over time, MS-13 expanded into Central America, including El Salvador, where it has had a significant presence. For many years, the country has been marked by intense criminal activity, staining its streets with violence. All these forms of violence are linked to crimes related to drug trafficking, sexual abuse, extortion, arms smuggling, kidnapping, robbery, and homicides. The Maras, from their beginnings more than 2 decades ago, were criminal organizations influenced in their origins by Salvadoran gangs and other immigrants from Central American countries settled in California. However, over time, Mara Salvatrucha developed very specific characteristics within the context of El Salvador. Historically, the Maras controlled important territories in the country's major cities. For those living in these communities, outsiders were considered the security agents and law enforcement of the state. This was because the rules governing the daily lives of these inhabitants were dictated by the gangs. These rules could be summarized in their main law, which was expressed as see, hear, and be silent. The level of enforcement of this violent law was so high that territories under Mara control were often covered in graffiti related to the gang, and erasing them or attempting to do so could even result in death for those who dared. The level of criminal activity perpetrated by this gang reached its peak in 2022. March 26, 2022, became the bloodiest day in recent history for El Salvador, with a total of 62 murders. This massacre was related to the breakdown of a pact between the government of El Salvador and the Mara Salvatrucha gang, as detailed in the investigation. Over the weekend of March 26th and 27th, a total of 87 homicides occurred, marking an unprecedented wave of killings in the Central American country. The evening before the massacre, there was a strange spike in murders, but it wasn't until Saturday when the numbers became shocking and spread throughout the country, seemingly without any apparent logical pattern. The victims did not correspond to young men or women from a particular area of El Salvador but seemed to be random killings with no clear explanation. However, these homicides had a particular impact in areas controlled by MS-13 in the country. This marked the beginning of what was called the war against the gangs led by Bukele, and on March 27, a state of emergency was initiated as part of the security strategy to combat the gangs, as we will explain later. 1 year after that massacre, the struggle between Bukele's government and the gangs continues. Although there are now numerous members of these gangs behind bars, according to the president's reports. One of the most recent leaders to be imprisoned was Amadeo Yovani Hernandez Perla, known as El Grillo, who was sentenced to 694 years in prison for being responsible for at least 23 homicides, among other crimes. The decision of a court specializing in organized crime was made public on Tuesday, August 15, 2023. This leader has the large letters MS, Mara Salvatrucha, tattooed on his body and operated in municipalities in the eastern part of his country. In addition to facing trial for the 23 violent deaths, he was prosecuted for 2 cases of solicitation and conspiracy to commit aggravated homicide, participation in terrorist organizations, aggravated extortion, aggravated robbery, theft, and attempted homicide. Following the violent weekend of March 27, 2022, the president requested the National Assembly to implement a state of exception in order to improve the execution of the so-called war against the gangs. This measure resulted in an impressive military deployment throughout the nation, with the intention of addressing the sources of the high levels of violence in the country. The state of exception allowed the government to make arrests without a judicial warrant, a circumstance that initially seemed to yield results for the president as incidents of interpersonal violence and the activity of organized criminal gangs began to decrease. However, after 14 extensions of the suspension of guarantees for implementing measures aimed at reducing violence from 2022 until today, according to the country's inhabitants, there have been dozens of arrests and human rights violations, as well as irregularities in cases of aggression and even deaths. These situations have led to complaints from citizens and national and international organizations against the country. To better understand how all of this is affecting the population of El Salvador, there's nothing better than hearing real testimonies. Let's look at a case gathered in the report on the first year of the state of exception conducted by the main human rights and civil society organization in the Central American country, Cristo Sal, in May 2023. The experience of a young man, who was released after being declared innocent, recounts the alleged abuses to which he and other detainees were subjected by the state.
While they were kneeling, they were given electric shocks, and one of them even had blood drawn. Upon entering the area where they were going to stay, the guards beat them again.
Specifically, Cristo Sal has documented the deaths of 153 people in state custody, all detained during the state of exception. Of these, 29 died violently, and another 46 from probable violent death or suspicion of criminality. A common pattern is noted in the presence of lacerations, bruises indicating beatings, wounds from sharp or blunt objects, as well as signs of strangulation or hanging on the bodies. One of these cases was that of a 52-year-old man, a store owner and mill operator, who had been harassed by gang members for years and forced to provide them with food. This person was arrested and accused of collaborating with them. After his arrest and subsequent death, according to the report from the Legal Medicine Institute of El Salvador, he died of cerebral edema caused by multiple injuries while in state custody. According to many Salvadorans, the government has used this security measure as a means of repression that, according to human rights experts in the country and United Nations rapporteurs, as well as organizations like Human Rights Watch, aims to justify human rights violations, all in order to create the illusion that, in this way, good Salvadorans will be safer. And thus, we conclude the first part of our journey today. We look forward to seeing you in the second part, where we will analyze the opinions of experts, international organizations, and discuss the Center for Counterterrorism Confinement, its actual operation, figures, and results. We will also re-examine how these new aspects are affecting the country's residents. It has been a pleasure to have you as a companion on this new extraordinary walk. If you enjoyed our video, don't hesitate to leave us a comment, like, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the second part of this extraordinary walk.